Hello everyone, I'm Manuel Vidigueira, and I will be presenting our system called ChopChop. First of all, this is joint work with my coworkers and advisor Rachid. Some of you might wonder why I found such a young picture of my advisor, but that is a secret. And let us get started with the paper. Here's a brief outline of my presentation. I will start by telling you the essential parts of our paper and what you should remember. And then I will go into a little bit more detail into later sections. To make it accessible for everyone, I'll only cover one of the main techniques we use in this paper, and I'll abstract away most of the rest. So let's start with the what, why, and how. And the first is, what is this paper about? Well, this paper is about improving the practical performance of Byzantine Atomic Broadcast. And when comparing with the best previous atomic broadcast systems for authenticating messages, we can achieve throughput increases of nearly 1.5 orders of magnitude, especially for small message sizes, such as those used in banking operations. I will go back to these results at the end. And why should you care about this? Well, Byzantine Atomic Broadcast is the backbone of state-machine replication and blockchain systems. As you know, these systems are used in thousands of applications to tolerate crashed or even malicious computers. So it's in a very important use case. And how do we actually achieve this? Well, ChopChop improves practical performance of Byzantine Atomic Broadcast systems via a technique called batch distillation. So in a typical normal batch of client operations, we have per each request a message with the payload, a signature authenticating this message, and a sequence number, right? And in general, for small message sizes, the signature can actually be quite a bit of overhead. And in general, they're a bit slow to verify because we have to verify each individual signature at the server. By contrast, our distilled batches are compact, and they are faster to verify. So distilled batches essentially take the good information from the batch. So that's essentially the package, the message, the good put, and some information of provenance, such as the ID. And this is an image to scale for a batch size of 2 to the power 16 and a message size of 8 bytes. 8 bytes might seem unreasonably small, but it's actually enough information for a destination and an amount of assets to transfer. So our distilled batches have a compact size. It's essentially 0 amortized over the size of the batch. What you see in red is essentially 200 bytes, and the rest is just payloads. They're fast to verify, and they're even safe to compute on an untrusted third party. So this leads to more efficient network use, more efficient CPU use, and correct service can even safely outsource the distillation process, which is a bit expensive, to third parties. So those were the main takeaways, but let's dive into some details, starting with some background. So in atomic broadcast, users typically broadcast operations, and servers deliver them in the same order safely. So accounting for potentially malicious users, and accounting for potentially some malicious servers. So the Byzantine Atomic Broadcast primitive, in its entirety, authenticates, distributes, and orders these operations, and tolerates F, up to a third of malicious servers. And mempool protocols were an innovation that have been around for a while, but have been taken to new levels with Narwhal, which is a paper from a couple of years ago, which really improved the throughput of atomic broadcast systems. And essentially, a mempool protocol separates the job of authenticating and distributing the operations from ordering. So ordering is only now on batches, or an identifier of a batch, which is much faster. And the bottleneck essentially now resides in the mempool protocol. And this is really all you need to know, and I will focus on mempool protocols from now on because you will be able to understand where our improvements come from, just from that. So in a mempool protocol, the first step is simply building a batch. The users, which are generally geographically close by, send operations to a server, which forms a batch. The second step, this server is essentially going to share this batch with at least F other servers for a total of F plus 1, which means at least 1 is correct, which will individually verify and store that batch. Now, as you can see, the batch here is a full batch with all the signatures. So now let's take a little bit of a look into what the overhead of this technique is and what are the bottlenecks. Now, for this section, just remember that a normal batch is going to be coded in orange, has an overhead of B, where B is the number of operations in the batch, so B signatures, while the distilled batch in blue has an overhead of, which is constant, 1 signature for the whole batch. And green is simply a negligible amount of data, which doesn't really matter for network bandwidth usage purposes. So the normal mempool, our main baseline, proceeds much like a normal mempool. The users send the batch to the server, and F+1 servers essentially delegate the job of verifying and storing the batch to a local trusted pool of workers. If one of these workers fails, the entire pool is compromised. They're all a trusted resource. So essentially, it's kind of like vertically scaling each individual server. So these are F+1 normal batch receptions for bandwidth, and F+1 normal batch verifications, at least. This can lead to a server network bottleneck or a server CPU bottleneck, or both, depending on your resource balance. So now for distillation, the main dish. Distillation is the process of converting a normal batch into a distilled batch. And how do we do this? Well, the first step is collecting valid client requests, much like the previous step in the previous mempools. Here, I used a different letter for the aggregator because we can use untrusted third parties. It doesn't have to be a server, although a server can take the job of an aggregator. But here, I will use the letter B for broker, which is the name we give to our aggregator. So the users send their operations to the aggregator, which verifies them, their individual signatures and forms a batch. The second step is that the aggregator is going to include these requests into an accumulator. An accumulator is a cryptographic tool which represents a set of elements. And moreover, it's a small thing. You can simply think of it as a Merkle tree on this batch of requests. It amounts to 32 bytes. So the third step is we're actually going to contact the clients again. We're individually going to send to each of these clients a proof that their request is inside of this accumulator. So Merkle proof, in this case, for a batch of 500 operations, is going to be around 1 kilobyte per client. And they are geographically close, so even though this results in a communication step, it's small in terms of latency compared to a global round trip. The clients are going to verify these proofs, and they're going to sign with a BLS signature. A BLS is a different signature scheme that allows signatures, especially for the same message, to be aggregated into a single one. So each client is going to individually sign with the BLS scheme the root of the tree, the accumulator, and the aggregator is simply going to combine all of these BLS signatures into a single aggregate BLS signature, which, because it's on the same message, it's on the root of the Merkle tree, it's going to be fast to verify. So what does a fully distilled batch look like? Well, essentially, it's an aggregate BLS signature, 192 bytes, and payloads. I'm omitting some small details here when it comes to sequence numbers, but really the signature part is really the heavy part here. So distilled batch verification, how does it work? Well, when a server receives a distilled batch, we simply try to form the accumulator again from the payloads. We read the payloads and we form the accumulator just like the broker did. We look at the IDs and we find out what the corresponding public keys are from a local map. We assume that the clients are registered at the servers. And then we can use that to form the aggregate public key, and we verify the root of this batch, the accumulator, against that public key and the accumulator. So yeah, that's it for distillation. And what does it look like in terms of results? Well, again, users are going to communicate with a single broker or a server if he's taking that role. Here we added a third party who's going to perform the distillation protocol. And instead of having F+1 batch receptions and verifications, normal batch receptions, we're going to have F+1 distilled batch receptions and verifications. Compared to Narwhal, which, to remind you, there were normal batch receptions and normal batch verifications. And the contrast is stark. We have here an example on the left side, the distillation ratio, which is when we don't distill batches at all on ChopChop. ChopChop is CC, so it's in red and blue. Narwhal is in green. And we achieve roughly a throughput of 1 million. The difference to Narwhal is essentially some other minor details which I didn't cover in this paper. but it's relatively minor, the order of magnitude. And when we distill batches, as you can see, we raise it by 1.5 orders of magnitude. And although batch distillation is much more effective on small message sizes, it still works for larger message sizes, as we see on the right side. And next, this is one of my favorite graphs. It shows how efficient network usage is in ChopChop compared to Narwhal. So here we have the network rate, which is the network usage in blue, and the input rate, which matches the output rate, up until, for example, in Narwhal, the 400,000 operations per second mark, which is when it hits the CPU bottleneck. And in gray is essentially the gap for 8-byte messages, in this case, of useful data going in the network versus the total data. And on the right side, as you can see, for ChopChop, this gap is quite close up until the CPU bottleneck is reached at 50 million operations per second for 8-byte messages. So in essence, that is ChopChop. We have distilled batches, which lead to better CPU usage and better network usage at a moderate latency cost. It's one local geographical round trip. It can be executed by untrusted third parties. And I would like to add as well that distilled batches, they can be combined with normal batches. So it's not either or thing. If, for example, a client fails to respond to the distillation protocol, we can simply include his original signature, which is verified as normal into servers. Naturally, this might take a little bit of a hit, but that is up to a policy that we can set. We can simply reject clients who don't participate in this protocol. And I am happy to take any questions. I won't stay between you and the end of the session.